And here we are on Tuesday. Good morning, John King.
Good morning, Peter. How are you doing?
Doing fantastic, and we want to welcome our special guest. I want to waste a single moment of his valuable time. Former Professor Rob Natelson, now, of course, the Senior Fellow for Constitutional Jurisprudence at the Independence Institute in Denver, Colorado. Good morning, Rob. Whoop, hello? Hello, Rob.
I'm here.
There he is. Okay.
Okay.
When you said senior, he didn't mean hard of hearing or anything like that.
What?
Peter just didn't hit the button.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So, Rob, what's happening over in the lovely state of Colorado? Do you have fires?
Actually, no. We had a very lush spring. I mean, those folks who, and I've seen a few notes in the Montana newspapers who say that the Montana spring and summer was evidence of global warming. They should have spent some time in Colorado. They would have thought that there was evidence of global cooling. It was extremely lush spring, extremely lush early summer, and the summer itself has been relatively cool.
Excellent.
Yeah, I guess this high-pressure system or low-pressure, I think it was a high-pressure system, pushed a lot of our nice weather over to you guys, so you're welcome.
I guess. I spent a lot of time in the outdoors, and the display of wildflowers here in Colorado this spring and summer especially, has just been extraordinary. I mean, it's impossible to describe. Colorado's always been good that way, but it's just amazing this year.
Yeah, the other kind thing that this weather pattern did is it welcomed into the Missoula Valley all the wonderful smoke from several large fires in Washington and Oregon and Idaho to just kind of settle in and visit us here in the Missoula Valley.
How kind of it.
Well, we were feeling a little left out this summer. It was relatively easy breathing for most of this summer. So
but we can't have that. So anyway.
Well, let's shift to someone who's not breathing real quick. I know you've done some work on Charles Carroll, a founding father that a lot of people haven't heard about. And I was thinking that maybe during this first half hour, maybe you could kind of expose what you found.
Well, I don't know if it's worth a full half hour. Charles Carroll was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was from Maryland. He was one of the minority of founding fathers who was not a Protestant Christian. He was a Catholic. In fact, he had attended Jesuit college in France and was a bit of a scholar. And he came to. I wrote about him recently because he prepared some arguments in favor of the Constitution during the ratification fight. He was a little taken aback. He expected to be elected to the Maryland Ratifying Convention, and he was not. So a speech that he wrote was never actually delivered because he wasn't at the convention to deliver it, but we have his notes, and they're indications of what educated opinion how educated opinion viewed the Constitution at the time. And then he apparently took the speech and published it anonymously. As you know, most publication on political issues in those days was done anonymously. And it went out and was distributed before the Constitution was fully ratified. So in its finished form, the speech had some impact. And so he had some interesting things to say about the role of the states, the role of the federal government, the role of jury trials, the right to keep and bear arms, and so forth.
Now, was it something that was lost to history, or they knew about it pretty well, or?
It was not lost to history, but it was republished recently. There is a series of books called the Documentary History of the Ratification of the Constitution of the United States. The documentary history is issued by the Wisconsin Historical Society, and there are some very top constitutional scholars who work on it. But it's taking forever. There's so much material, it's taking forever to publish. The publication schedule began in 1976.
Wow.
And volumes are still coming out. And some of the most recent volumes to come out are the Maryland volumes, just within the last year. And so the Maryland volumes include these two, the notes of Carroll's speech and then the final version of Carroll's speech. So their republication has excited some interest.
I understand that the Carroll speech kind of shines some light on the Second Amendment as well as on something you've been deeply involved with, the Convention of States.
Carroll actually doesn't say anything original. Mostly what he does is second the views of others so that you can see that those other views are not idiosyncratic. So, for example, in Federalist 46, James Madison talks about the role of an armed citizenry in protecting against, as the final line of defense against federal overreaching, the right of revolution. Now, this is not a constitutional remedy, obviously. It's an extra constitutional remedy when everything else is broken down. And Madison actually speaks about how the state militias, which consist of all able-bodied men between certain ages, will be fully armed, and they could resist federal troops in the event that the federal government became tyrannical. Well, it turns out that's not just Madison who had that view. Charles Carroll says almost exactly the same thing in his speech. He talks about the role of an armed citizenry in resisting against federal overreach. Similarly, he also seconds comments by other founders on the role of the states in checking and balancing the federal government. So he speaks about what we call horizontal balances and vertical balances. That is to say, he speaks about the balance between the three branches of the federal government, legislature, judicial, executive, but he also talks about the vertical balance, the federal government's ability to check the states and the states' ability to check the federal government. And then he also mentions the Article 5 amendment process and says that if the federal government gets out of line, then the states could use the amendment process in order to pull it back into line. Again, none of this is new. It just reconfirms that these were general views of the founders. He also talks about limits on federal power. When I was still at the University of Montana, I wrote an article which was published in the Nevada Law Review, called the Nevada Law Journal, called the Enumerated Powers of States. And in it, I explain all the different powers that the founders represented would belong to the states that the federal government couldn't interfere with. And again, Carroll does the same sort of thing. He lists powers that the federal government can't interfere with, such as religion or certain economic powers and so forth. So again, he's seconding what other founders had to say.
All right, well, we've got to go to a break. When we get back, I do want to talk a little bit about the federal government. I know you've done some work recently on this idea that states have some kind of right to the federal land in their realm, and that there might be some constitutional basis for shifting federal land ownership over to state land ownership. It's a subject that we've had on Talkback twice with the American Lands Council and also with a group on the other side advocating that it's unconstitutional that such a transfer take place. We'll get Rob's point of view after the break.
Not only that, they're also violently opposed to the states having any access to taking back over federal lands because they feel the states will just sell it. They'll just sell it to make money, and it'll be the McDonald's forest or whatever. So,
as of yet, I don't know if any violence has taken place.
Well, you know what I
find
mean.
out.
The rhetoric is pretty violent. Well, we're going to come right back with more of Talk Back in a moment. It's Talk Back. It's Tuesday, and that means Rob Natelson, the first Tuesday of the month. Rob Natelson from the Independence Institute in Denver, Colorado. So, John, you asked a question before the break.
Yeah, I know you've been doing some work recently, Rob, about the American Lands Council and its efforts to try to shift federal government lands back to the states. And I was wondering where you weighed in on that issue.
Oh boy, that's a big one. And it's not one that I've been traditionally involved in, although I did do a study back in 2005 of the original meaning of the Constitution with respect to federal land ownership. So I can talk a bit about it. And more recently, I've actually been through the organic laws of all the states. In other words, all the treaties and the enabling acts and acts of admission and so forth that created the states. I've gone through them all. So I can speak a little bit about that. I can tell you initially that this is an area where there is a tremendous amount of ignorance on all sides. I mean, very often the heat of the rhetoric reflects the depth of the ignorance. And that's certainly true in this particular area.
Well, what are the things that people get wrong in their ignorance? What do you think?
Well, let's start with two polar positions: the traditional liberal position and the traditional conservative position. The traditional conservative position has been the federal government cannot own any land except that which is justified through the enclave clause. In other words, where there is a special cession made by the state, a special ceding of the land made by the state. And therefore, all other federal land ownership is unconstitutional. That's the traditional conservative position. Well, I think that's wrong, because I think that the other enumerated powers certainly give the federal government the power to own property, which is not necessarily an enclave. For example, if the federal government wants to buy land for a post office or for a building for the IRS, they certainly have the authority to do so. Part of the conservative position also is that the land that is not owned by the federal government has to be handed over to state ownership. That is actually clearly wrong for reasons I'll explain in a minute. And then on the liberal side, the argument has been that the federal government can hold however much land it wants for whatever purpose in perpetuity if it so desires. And that strikes me as also egregiously wrong. So the truth, as often happens in that situation, is somewhere in the middle. Do we have time before the break for me to explain the middle?
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think so.
Right ahead.
Okay. Well, actually, we don't know how big the middle is.
Okay. Well, the federal government, the federal Constitution, as I read it, and as the founders seem to have represented it, gives the federal government power to own land for any enumerated purpose. So that means that the federal government has the power, as it does, to raise armies and have a navy and run the post office and so forth. That certainly the federal government can own land for those purposes, whether the host state likes it or not, and it can do so in perpetuity. It doesn't have the advantage of an enclave, which gives certain advantages to the federal government unless the states consent, but the federal government certainly can have title to the land necessary to carry out its functions. On the other hand, I think it's also rather clear from the text of the Constitution, when you read it carefully, and what was said about it at the founding, that the federal government has the obligation to dispose of all the rest of the land. That it doesn't have the authority, for example, to own acreage just for the purpose of grazing. There's nothing about grazing in the Constitution, or mining. That land has to be disposed of, but not necessarily handed over to the state. That land has to be disposed of in a way that serves the best interests of the American people. And how the land is disposed of depends upon, the kind of acreage it is. So if, for example, it is grazing land or mining land, it should be sold to the highest bidder. It should be moved out of the government realm. It should no longer be socialized, in other words, and turned over to the private sector. If, on the other hand, the land is environmentally sensitive land that should be preserved for its environmental values, then there should be a different disposition, which does not involve selling to the highest bidder. You could set up perpetual trusts to protect the land, as is done with environmental treasures in England, or you could give it to the state, subject to covenants, to make sure the state doesn't abuse it or sell it. But whatever disposition method is used, it has to be disposed of in a way for the best interest of the American people. That may, in some cases, involve handing over to the state, but in other cases it may involve keeping in perpetual trust, or it may involve selling to the highest bidder. Whatever the situation is, it's very clear under the Constitution and what was said about it at the founding that the federal government has no business owning 30% of the country, and in fact, control by the central government over that much territory was one of the reasons why the Magna Carta was extracted from King John.
I wanted to ask you about the best interest of the American people bright line that you drew there, because I think a lot of times the conflict is between the American people and the people of a state. what the federal government wants to do with the land and what the people in the state might want to do with the land?
Well, the answer to your question, John, is the obligation of the federal government in disposition is a trust obligation to the American people as a whole. So let's take, for example, Yellowstone National Park. It's possible that the best interest of the citizens of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho would be turning over the park to the governments of those states. I'm not saying it necessarily would be, but you could make that argument. But that probably would not be in the best interest of the people of the United States. So if we want to protect Yellowstone Park, and as you know, I'm a big advocate of the outdoors, and I spend a lot of my time in the outdoors. If we want to protect Yellowstone National Park, and we should, then we probably should do it through some mechanism other than socialized ownership, and probably the best way is transfer either to those states under some kind of very firm trust arrangement, or transfer to a perpetual environmental trust with a provision that if whoever is holding the title to the land violates the terms of that agreement, then the feds can pull it back and transfer it to trustees who will respect it.
Okay, we're going to take a little break. Come right back. 721-1290. You have a question or a comment? We have 2 lines open. If you'd like to visit with Rob Natelson, give us a call. 721-1290. This is Talkback. It's the Tuesday edition of Talkback, about 2.5 minutes now before our hard break at the top of the hour. So go ahead, John.
Yeah, we were just talking about disposition of federal lands to the states. One of the things that comes up a lot of times are the issue of the Sagebrush Rebellion. Can you talk about that a little bit, Rob?
In about 2 minutes.
Well, that was a movement during the Carter administration, which argued that the federal government should devolve its land down to the states. And it was passed, it occurred in response to a federal law passed in 1976, in which the federal government clearly announced we have no intention of disposing of most of our lands. But once President Reagan was elected in 1980, the movement petered out. The people who were in the movement, I think, were not very clever politically, and they didn't realize that the problem of federal disposition was not one that was going to be solved by merely electing a Republican. And sure enough, it wasn't. And here we are talking about the same issue 35 years later.
So what is the best historical case for a transfer?
I don't understand what you mean by historical case.
Well, is there a case if there?
Oh yeah,
of the federal government transferring land to the states in a quote unquote constitutional way?
Did that work out well?
It was done. It was done for all the states east of the Missouri. I mean, from the you look at the tier of states from Dakota down to Texas. All those states to the east, the vast bulk of their acreage was transferred either to the state or disposed of to the general public. There are a few areas where the federal government has holdings, but they're pretty minimal. It's only those of us in the West that are subjected to this huge amount of absentee landlordism by the federal government. And the argument of the American Lands Council and others is that that's simply not fair. It's not fair on a whole wide range of fronts, and I basically agree with that. I don't agree that constitutionally the land all has to be given to the state government. It has to be disposed of in a way that's best for the American people as a whole. Nevertheless, they're fundamentally right in saying that it is both wrong, inefficient, and unconstitutional for the federal government to be holding 50% of the land in the West.
Okay, we're going to take a little break. Come right back after the top of the hour. And if you have a question or comment, we'll get into general questions. Love to take your calls for Rob Natelson from the Independence Institute. He's here to answer your questions about the Constitution, so hope you'll stay with us. It's coming up on 9 o'clock. Okay, we're back, ladies and gentlemen. John King. I'm Peter Christian, joining us on the phone from the Independence Institute. It's our monthly visit with one of our favorite guests, Rob Natelson, talking about the Constitution and how, of course, it affects us today as we look at the past.
Now, of course, all of the Talkback listenership thinks very highly of Rob, as do I. But Mitchell wants to know and wonders if President Trump would put Rob Natelson on the Supreme Court, which is an interesting question, Mitchell. I wonder if he would force all the Supreme Court candidates to do a live TV program to see who gets to reign supreme.
Well, let me respond to that in two ways. Number one, I am not now. Have I?
Well, we have lost him. I don't know. It's gone. We'll just have to chit-chat a little bit. Well, while Rob's away, I will read a little bit of an article that I spoke with Rob about during the break that I thought maybe our listenership might be interested in.
I think we have him back.
Is
Hello,
he back?
Rob.
What is going on there, Tim?
We do not know.
I was attempting to push a button to make something important happen, and the worst thing happened.
Peter, when I had my show today in Montana,
Yes.
back in the late '90s,
Yes.
we had one episode where we had an engineer who screwed things up so much that some caller called up and said, "Have you guys been taken over by the government or something?"
Well, I do have my government-issued junior engineer badge. So
Did you hear my comment about?
No, we didn't hear your comment.
So go ahead.
All right, the comment. The question was whether a President Trump would put me on the Supreme Court, and my response was, number one, I'm not interested in judgeship and never have been, and number two, there isn't going to be a President Trump. Next question.
Well, now hold on a second.
I'm with Rob on this.
Hold
one.
on a second. Now I'm in the realm of possibilities here. Why would there never be a President Trump?
Let's just say that in recent surveys, Planned Parenthood had higher favorability than President Trump.
Then why is he so far ahead in the Republican polls?
I don't think he is. I think a lot of people are pinch hitting, saying they're Republicans to say they like Trump because they want to see Trump succeed in the same way that I want to see Bernie Sanders succeed.
I mean, they like some of the things he's saying right now, but the fact is that for someone to be elected president, he generally has to have political skills significantly in excess of what Donald Trump has.
Well, he knows how to command a microphone. That is part of the game.
And many of the things that he's saying now that cause a quarter of the Republican electorate to like him are actually part of his subsequent self-destruction.
Because it means his brashness, he doesn't seem to have any sort of limitations as to where he wants his.
Well, sure, he has
comments.
big limitations. He won't tell you where he actually stands on policy.
Let me give you one example: the comment about rapists coming over the border, and the general negative comment about Mexicans. Okay,
right.
That endears him to a few people in some quarters, but the fact is, for Republicans to win the White House, they've got to get a significant percentage of the Hispanic vote, and Republican Party activists know that, and they're not going to nominate somebody who has no chance of getting more than 3% of the.
Well, now hold on. Forgive me here, but isn't it the electorate that will make that decision, and not the powers that be? That's why we have primaries.
No, I said Republican activists.
Oh,
that's
okay.
great. That's much broader context than the powers that be, but it's also a narrower group than the electorate. People who vote in party primaries disproportionately tend to be the activists.
Okay.
And so where they want to go is generally the direction the party goes, except in a few instances where you've got a truly extraordinary event that causes huge popular participation. That's very rare. Or in instances where the powers that could be can manipulate things. But generally it's the party activists who have the decisive voice and who gets elected, and they're not going to nominate Donald Trump.
Well, so, John seems to think that Trump is his secret plan is to win the nomination and then just defer to Hillary because he supported her in the past.
No, that's not my thought.
Well, yeah,
that's what you said.
No, I think that he is in there at Hillary's whim, but I think he's really there for his own book selling. I mean, he has a book. I'm not joking. He has a book coming out on Thursday, the first day of the debate. This was planned.
Okay, go ahead.
The other thing, of course, he has contributed money to Hillary in the past. If you want to look at another conspiratorial theory, he's going to run third party and throw the election to the Democrat just the way Perot did. But I just think it's a big ego trip, and I don't think it should be taken seriously, especially in this year, where the Republicans have a truly fine collection of candidates. I mean, there are just outstanding people in that field. I think Trump is a flash in the pan. Maybe a year from now will prove that I'll be proven wrong, but I doubt it.
Now, let me ask you this. My wife and I have been really impressed by Bobby Jindal.
Yeah.
He's an incredibly intelligent guy. He's been a successful leader of a state for 2 terms. So he has, the leadership ability, and yet nobody seems to be paying him any attention at all.
Oh, I think that might be too strong, but you're right. He hasn't broken out from the field. I mean, you've got, 16 announced candidates.
Right.
And so that means that field is going to be really chopped up. Now, what's going to happen is that people are going to start dropping out. They're going to drop out because they don't have any money, or because they make fatal mistakes in the debate, or they cut a deal with another candidate whereby they agree to support that other candidate. And who knows? I mean, Jindal may be one of the survivors. I agree with you. He's an outstanding candidate, and in that respect, though, he's in a field of outstanding candidates. I mean, other than Trump, it's hard to find a bad candidate there who's not qualified to be president.
Sure.
Well, let's see how your forecasting is.
Nope.
Who do you think will win the primary?
I have no clue. Remember, I devote almost all my time now to constitutional issues, and certainly I've got a political background, but the field, but I don't keep up with it, as like it was a full-time job. All I can say is that I'm not sure anybody, even with a full-time job following this stuff, knows, because the field is so fragmented. I would be surprised if Jeb Bush won the nomination. He'll have a lot of money, but I just think that the degree of Bush fatigue is too
much.
strong.
Yeah, too much baggage. And we're going to come right back. Pete, if you'll hang on the phone just a minute, we also have one line open. If you'd like to visit with Rob Natelson, this is your one chance in the month to do it. If you have a question or a comment and get Rob's reaction, give us a call right now. It's 721-1290. We'll be right back. Hey, it's Talk Back, and it's Tuesday. The first Tuesday of the month means so we're visiting with Rob Natelson from the Independence Institute, and we like to get our callers on as quickly as possible. So, Pete, you are on with Rob Natelson. Go ahead, sir.
Now, my question is, if it hasn't already been addressed, I just tuned in a bit ago. The courts recently ruled on the EPA rule for CO2 emission control of coal-fired power plants that the way they had done it was inappropriate and couldn't be implemented as they had proposed. And then King Barack comes out yesterday and essentially gives an executive order almost saying duplicate what the court rejected that the EPA instituted. And I'm just wondering what kind of vulnerability that has to the court saying, hey, we've already addressed this.
Okay. What do you think, Rob?
Well, the strategy of the Obama administration, as far as I can see it, is to outrun the courts. The idea is that if they come up with enough, fast enough,
Thanks, Pete.
that it will take long enough for the courts to react, that they will have accomplished their purpose in the meantime. It's a very lawless approach, and to a certain extent, the strategy is an effective one, because they can move fast and the courts move slowly.
So why is it lawless? I understand
that it's lawless because they're defying the courts, and they are trying to push the envelope on the law. The president's job is not to rewrite the law, and it's not to violate the law or push the envelope on the law. The president's job is, and I'm quoting the Constitution here, to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. It's a lawless or an unconstitutional strategy.
Well, now, Rob, what I see the president doing, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I usually am, but what I see him doing in many of the things he's doing, he is saying to himself, I am the smartest guy in the country. I know what is best. So this is what we're going to do. I will find a way to make it happen, and eventually the people, whether it's Obamacare or these EPA rules or whatever, eventually the rest of the country is going to realize, hey, this was a pretty smart guy. We should have listened to him in the first place. He was right. So do you get that sense as well?
Well, I think they're hoping that when they put changes into effect, that they'll quickly become institutionalized and impossible to reverse. Whether people actually think that they're the best idea in retrospect is dubious. Let me give you an example. In 1965, we adopted the Medicaid program, a federal program purportedly for medical care for the poor. Well, every state already had programs for the care of the poor. There was no need to federalize it. But they did it anyway, and now huge amounts of money, businesses, livelihoods are built around the Medicaid program, and it's virtually impossible to reverse. I think that's exactly what the Obama administration wants to do. The other point, and I've made this from time to time before on this program, is it isn't just Mr. Obama. I mean, he's got a whole administration full of people who think like him, and what that is hard left, or as they like to call themselves, progressive. These are not your granddaddy's liberals. These are folks. There's a strong streak of what I call soft totalitarianism that runs through their thinking. I think it's anti-American, frankly, that mode of thinking, but it's there, and they want what they want, and they're willing to go as far as they can possibly do to get it. And they don't much care about the constitutional system, and they don't much care about the rule of law because they're secure, as you suggest, in their own wisdom and their own righteousness.
I wanted to read a little bit of the court's decision that was issued last year in the last EPA fight that they had. Here it is. Quote, when an agency claims to discover in a long extant statute an unheralded power to regulate a significant portion of the American economy, we typically greet its announcement with a measure of skepticism, the court warned. We expect Congress to speak clearly if it wishes to assign to an agency decisions of vast economic and political significance, end quote.
Yeah, that represents the modern Supreme Court's tendency to lean against assumptions of power by the bureaucracy or even by Congress that are not fully spilled out. The problem with that reasoning is that they shouldn't be leaning against it, they should be simply stopping it. I mean, there are very few agencies that should be granted any power, whether Congress wants to grant them power or not, to control vast parts of the United States economy, okay? So what they're leaning against the wind when, in fact, they should be standing against the wind.
All right. We had an interesting challenge for you, Rob, and I think that I'll let you take it because you're a tough guy. You're a tough guy.
They should be blowing back.
This is we had a caller that wanted to know, what have you changed? And I think, every scholar has to deal with this. You're confronted with only one life, and you want to have a valuable contribution in your life. What do you feel that you've done as a constitutional scholar that's changed anything?
Well, was the question as a constitutional scholar, or was the question in my life?
Well, it was kind of more in your life.
Let's start with my activity in Montana. Now, that's not as a constitutional scholar; that was an activist. Through the movements that I led, with the help of hundreds and hundreds of other good people, we stopped the round, the process, the vicious cycle every year where you had an increase in taxes every year, followed by a budget deficit, followed by another increase, followed by a budget deficit. We helped to bring down the Montana income tax, which at the time we began our activity was the highest in the country, tied with California. We helped to adopt ethics legislation in Montana. I mean, the list goes on of what we accomplished there. As a constitutional scholar, there have been now a number of Supreme Court decisions that have cited my work. In some cases, those decisions have been concurring decisions that help to form the majority of the court. Also, my work has the methodology that I've developed in the area of study of the Constitution has been very widely adopted, often without acknowledgement, but it was. Even though I have a blog post up this week pointing out that even though the prestige law reviews don't like to publish my work, it does get out and it does become influential, and then the prestige law reviews have to try to find a way of rebutting it.
Responding.
So I'm not going to spend any more time bragging on myself, but I think, I have accomplished a few things.
Well, we're going to take a little break. One of the things that Rob has accomplished, I don't mean to embarrass him, is he has thrilled and delighted thousands and thousands of listeners on this radio program, and of course his own program back in the 90s, Today in Montana, and So anyway, we're going to come back and take a little break here. So
And the seeds of education that someone sows are not easy to measure.
Exactly.
But they affect people going into the future. And I know that happened with countless law students at the University of Montana and with myself.
So we're going to come right back. Stay with us. This is Talk Back, and we'll continue to learn for the next 40 minutes or so. And if you would like to tap into this well of wisdom, ladies and gentlemen, lines are up. Not mine. I've got a thimble full. But Rob Natelson's still with us until 10 o'clock. 721-1290. We'll be right back. This is Talk Back, 721-1290, being my little hi-hat here. That's John King. I'm Peter Christian. Rob Natelson joining us from the Independence Institute in Denver, Colorado. Let's get Chuck on the line. Chuck, you're on with Rob Natelson. Go ahead, sir.
Hello. My Uncle Robert used to come from Butte with a gentleman by the name of Cress Sear, and they would give a talk on the Sedition Act, and I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Which Sedition Act are we talking about?
I'm sorry, I let him go.
The Alien and Sedition Acts, I assume?
Yeah.
Well, it could be that. He might be talking about the Sedition Act that was passed during World War I. So I'm not quite sure which Sedition Act we're talking about.
Give us a call back. I'm sorry, I pushed the button too quickly. We had a very bad hum in your line. So anyway, 721-1290.
Well, why don't you just give us a quick primer? What are Sedition Acts in general?
Well, Sedition Acts are acts that make illegal certain political activities. That might be, it might be as drastic as making illegal just speaking against the government. Or it might be a law that specifies that organizing to overthrow the government is illegal. It's a very, very wide category. Some Sedition Acts are constitutional. I mean, a Sedition Act that prevents, for example, conspiracies to overthrow the government, that's constitutional. On the other hand, a Sedition Act that, say, prohibits criticizing the President of the United States, that would clearly be unconstitutional.
Right.
And there have been two major federal Sedition Acts passed in our history, and quite a number of them passed at the state level.
Okay, let's get back to the phone. And
Chuck is on line 3.
Okay, let's get Chuck on. Chuck, I'm sorry I let you go too soon, but there's a bad hum in your line. What Sedition Act are you speaking of, sir?
Well, I don't know, other than the fact that they would come down to the law school and give a talk on, how they weren't exactly popular because they were defending a communist. He was accused of, violent overthrow of the U.S. government.
So this is in the 50s.
Okay, I think the Sedition Acts that they're talking about may be the Sedition Acts passed both at the federal level and in Montana during World War I. I think that's the one they're speaking about. And there's no question that those Sedition Acts went much too far in oppressing civil rights. Now, that, to a certain extent, you sort of expect that in wartime, but I think they were over the top even for that time.
Okay, let's get Mike on the line. Mike, you're on with Rob Natelson. Go ahead, sir.
Hey, Rob. I had a question with regards to the situation with the country's immigration policy.
Sure.
I've heard it said that that Ronald Reagan would not have won the most recent election if the demographic makeup was then what it is now, and that Romney would have won had it been that way. And it seems like we have a policy of both legal and illegal immigration that brings in more and more people from essentially third world countries, and that those people then vote overwhelmingly for Democratic candidates who promise to give them free stuff. And you're a very insightful guy, and I was wondering if you can explain to me why it is that most Republicans seem to support continued high levels of immigration and also seem to tap dance around the notion of what to do with illegal immigrants already here. It would seem that the Republican Party's best interest would be to limit immigration, both legal and illegal, other than perhaps if they're just trying to please the corporate donors who want cheap labor. I'll just turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
Well, that's an area in which I don't have much expertise, therefore I'll opine on it anyway.
It's spoken like a true not politician.
It is true that the current perception is that the the groups that are most coming in are going to help the Democrats more than the Republicans. That's not invariably true. I mean, we've had quite a few Cuban immigrants, for example, and they've helped to make the Florida state government Republican. But there is that perception. I think the reason the Republican Party is split actually has something to do with what the caller said, which is that you have a large business constituency in the Republican Party that wants relatively inexpensive labor, and therefore they look kindly on immigration. And that's not all bad. I'm speaking as someone, by the way, who is the son of an immigrant and the grandson of two others. But here in Colorado, about 21% of the state is Hispanic. Many Hispanics trace their ancestry back to the 18th century. They were here before the Anglos were, but many have come in more recently. But for the most part, the Hispanics in Colorado are very hardworking people that do take a lot of jobs that other people might not find desirable. So there is that. There's that constituency in the Republican Party, and then there are other parts of the Republican Party, and they would tend to be more in the northern part of the country, like Montana, who would take a much more negative view of immigration. My own view is that legal immigration is fine, illegal immigration is not. That's my view in a nutshell.
I'm with you. In fact, I think as a Republican that is pro-immigration and a Republican that lived overseas for a time, it's really easy for me to sympathize with someone that wants to be here. And I would like to make it as easy as possible for you to legally immigrate and contribute to society and a society that you want to live and be a part of if you can.
Okay. We're going to come right back, continue this. Dave is waiting on the line. We have one line open. Rob Natelson joining us from the Independence Institute in Denver, and we'll be right back. Oh, yeah. We're back on Talkback, 721-1290. This, of course, is a very special day because Rob Natelson joining us, not in studio, but from his studio in the Palatial Independence Institute, high up on a hill overlooking the lovely Rocky Mountains of Denver. How's that? Pretty good, huh?
Yeah. Who lives in a Jetsons pod, high above us all. We have a question real quick from Elena. She says, quote, I understand that Rob drafted the rules for the Convention of States that were presented at a July Convention of States caucus. Where could I see a copy of those rules?
Yeah, I was asked to draft proposed rules for public comment for a Convention of States, and it was the Convention of States movement, the specific organization, that asked me to do it. My understanding, and I've not seen this yet, is that they're going up on a website sponsored by conventionofstates.com. So what you do is you go to conventionofstates.com and look for the posted rules. I don't know if they're up yet, but they should be shortly.
Okay, let's get back to the phone. And Dave, you're on with Rob Natelson. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, good morning. You were talking about Donald Trump earlier and where he spent his money. And according to the Wall Street Journal, Hillary Clinton got $700 from Trump, whereas George W. Bush got $2,000. And according to the paper article, he has spent $535,000 on Democrats and $700,000 on Republicans. Now, I'm not a fan of big money in politics. I think it messes it up, but the law is the law.
You know that's only looking at the last 4 years. So Trump made a big change about 4 years ago in the way he spends. And if you just go from before that change, the spending is very different than recent spending.
Okay, that's a good argument.
Also, President Bush was running for the presidency. Hillary Clinton was a senator.
Right.
You expect a differential.
Well, he gave $8,000 to John McCain, and our inspector got $8,000. I think he spread it around for purposes of influence.
Well, when you're a businessman and not a politician, when you're a businessman, you want to grease both sides of the skid so that whoever wins, you're going to be in like Flint.
Right, and that's sad. Should be stopped.
but it's pretty smart. I mean, because you have to deal with things as they are, Dave. Right?
Yes, but maybe we should change what is happening. why should million-dollar billionaires control our government?
Agreed. And as far as control, I'm not so sure on, but if you're greasing the skids and you're donating to the Clinton Foundation, I think that you might have an issue in the next election.
Well, thank you.
All right, thanks for the call. So, Rob, what do you think?
Well, the information on Trump speaks for itself, but I think if you want to get money out of politics, what you have to do is get politics out of the money. In other words, you've got to reduce the size of the federal government so that you don't have a situation where any bureaucrat or group of bureaucrats can pass a regulation that can destroy your business. So the reason, the phenomenon of money in politics is a symptom. It's not a cause, and dealing with the symptom is just going to cause dysfunction out somewhere else.
So, Rob, do I hear you say it's a chicken and egg scenario?
No, it's not a chicken and egg situation.
Okay.
The root cause is a situation where you have the government in the position to destroy or greatly damage anybody's livelihood with the passing of a regulation. You're not going to get the money out of politics or get the influence out of politics, probably ever, but you're not going to substantially reduce it until you substantially reduce the power of the government over the economy.
And there's the question, how does one who is used to having power voluntarily relinquish it?
I'm not sure what your point is there.
Well, there is no voluntary. It's not a single entity. It's an organism made up of a lot of different people's brains, right? Government isn't a personal pronoun.
Well, it certainly seems to be today.
Yeah, that's where the Convention of States things comes in.
Okay.
Removing power from Washington D.C.
Okay, let's get Roy on the line. Roy, you're on with Rob. Go ahead.
Yeah. Good morning, Rob, and good morning, everybody.
Hi, Roy.
I'm very concerned about what's happening with our federal government, and I've tried most of my adult life to educate and to teach, especially my children, that a disregard for the Constitution and the rule of law is a very serious matter. We got to the point right now where I think it's if we don't turn this around, the people don't turn this around very soon, the country's headed for another rebellion. I think it's very naive and foolish to think, and I hope there's some radical leftists listening to this program. It's very naive and foolish to think that you can disregard our Constitution and especially our Bill of Rights without severe consequences. That being that there are men in this country and women. I use the term men that covers men and women. There are men in this country that will not give up their rights as put forth in the Constitution without taking up arms against those who wish to take their rights away. Now, I realize this is the end result of tyranny, and it looks like that's where we're headed. I've done everything I can to stop it. I don't want to see another rebellion. I don't want to see another civil war. I realize there is a way to stop this lawless administration from doing what they're doing, and that is, in our Constitution, the founders gave us the impeachment process and also the unfit for office process. But nobody seems to be making any headway that way. They're being more or less laughed at for trying to even do something like that. So I'd like to know, Rob, any other way that we can stop this road to serfdom, or stop this lawless administration from taking us into a situation where there's very likely going to be some kind of a rebellion or worse, and a fast way to get this done. I'd like your comment on that. Thank you very much.
Okay, Roy, we're going to have Rob answer that when we come back from the break. And Emmett is also up. We have a line open now. It's 721-1290. Rob Natelson will answer Roy's concern here in just a moment. Hey, thanks for joining us here on Talkback. I'm Peter Christian. That's, of course, John King. Rob Natelson joining us from the Independence Institute in Denver.
So, what can we do to keep Roy from strapping on the gray and heading off to war, Rob?
Well, if you recall, he listed a number of problems we had and said that if they're not addressed, there is a risk of revolution. And he mentioned that the Constitution gives us the impeachment process, by which we can go after officials who abuse their trust. But the Constitution also gives us the Article 5 process. This is the process whereby the states can trigger a convention for proposing amendments. That's what the Constitution calls it, a convention for proposing amendments for the purpose of resetting the system. I mean, if, for example, if you want judicial term limits on Supreme Court justices, or if you want a balanced budget amendment, those would be the kinds of things that would require a convention of states to adopt. Historically, the amendment process has worked pretty well in correcting abuses. However, when the Montana legislature this past session had the opportunity to pass a convention of states resolution, they refused to do so. Rather than join 30 or so other states in this movement for a convention, they chose to listen to a few conspiracy theorists who had no qualifications to talk about what they were talking about. So if you really want to do something, what you have to do is put pressure on the Montana legislature to adopt an application calling for a convention for a balanced budget amendment, or calling for a convention of states to reduce the size of the federal government, or calling for a convention to impose on Congress a rule to prevent log rolling in Congress. That's something that, especially in Montana, where it's very doable because there are so many legislators and legislative districts are so small. But thus far, that movement really hasn't existed in Montana.
Oh, I wanted to bring up an issue with you because you're an author. You wrote a book called The Original Constitution, What It Actually Said and Meant, which our listeners can get. It's a great book, a little primer on the Constitution. Right. And there's another author out there who's written his own book on the Constitution, and I think you might disagree with each other. So Dr. Henry Bain titles himself a constitutional expert, and this is his own bio, by the way, a government researcher and as the author of, quote, The Constitution of the United States of America, Modern Edition. So Mr. Bain's modern edition has some differences than maybe the edition that Mr. Natelson has read in the past. So I want to read a little bit of a piece that he wrote that went out on the 4th of July. This is a piece that appeared in the Tulsa World. It's called Time to Modernize the Constitution. He says, all copies of the Constitution promulgate detailed instructions for the recapture of slaves who have run away from their owners. They also specify that slaves are to be counted as 3/5 of a person in the census, giving a boost to the slave-owning states in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. One might justify this presentation of our national charter by saying that it commemorates an earlier time or instructs students on the nation's political history. That kind of thinking has prevailed for a long time in Charleston, only recently yielding in the face of atrocity. Of course, he's referring to the shootings that occurred in Charleston. We would all be better off if all this language were consigned to the back of the document, and Americans were presented with a modern constitutional text that truly portrays our system of government as it exists in the 21st century, a constitution that deserves to be read aloud each year when the House of Representatives begins its sessions. I write on this subject with considerable feeling since I have spent several years studying the Constitution and reorganizing it to suit our modern era, which can be found in the Constitutional, and he highlights his book. So I just wanted to get your take on this. Do we need to kind of shift the location of the document, rearrange things so that we can understand it better, so that people can approach it more like a textbook of how the government actually works rather than a historical document?
Okay, let me deal with this in ascending order of importance. Number one, he talks about the fugitive slave clause being a detailed manual for the returning of slaves. It's one sentence, for crying out loud. It's not a detailed clause. Number two, the idea that the 3/5 compromise was adopted to build up slavery or build up the southern states is a myth. I've just written a scholarly article on this subject, which has been accepted for publication by Case Western Law Review in Ohio, and you can read about it. It's an article on the use of words like taxes and direct taxes in the Constitution. It's on my website, constitution.i2i.org. Then the idea that we should rearrange the Constitution, to, in effect, change history retroactively. That's maybe what I would expect from somebody who bills himself as a government researcher. The idea that we have amended the Constitution. We've adopted the 13th Amendment. The slavery stuff is gone. But to pretend that history doesn't exist, or to just look at the document without any appreciation of its history, is to take an Alzheimer's type view of the Constitution. You know, there are people who walk through life and they don't see anything but the present. They don't know where they came from, so they don't know where they're going. I don't think we should take an Alzheimer's view of the Constitution.
All right. Well, thanks for the insight there.
There you go. So he is now the bane of our existence. Anyways, I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. We're going to take a break. Emmett, we'll get your call on. We have one line open. Only about 8 minutes left with Rob Natelson. He's here once a month, so if you'd like to visit, give us a call right now. It's 721-1290. And we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. That's John King, Peter Christian, Rob Natelson, joining us from Denver, Colorado. So, I'm sorry. Go ahead, John.
We got phone calls, and then after that, some Facebook questions.
Okay. Emmett, you're on Talkback. Go.
Oh, thanks for taking my call. Yeah, it's been fascinating. But just briefly, you know, we were talking about a states convention, and it's fascinating, and I'm very disappointed with the Montana legislature that they didn't even want to go into a states' rights convention or a constitutional convention of states. But because of, you know, the disastrous Supreme Court rulings, let's say on Obamacare, or mostly same-sex marriage, you know, when the states, you know, were asked to vote on same-sex marriage, the people overwhelmingly voted against it, even in California. It was the courts that decided, no, we're overturning the will of the people. Could we introduce legislation in a states' rights convention that says marriage is between a man and a woman and ratify that in the Constitution, or outlaw abortion or other things? And I did like Roy's call. That was very good. So is that something we could even do if we entered a constitutional convention of states?
Okay, thanks, Emma. So what do you think, Rob? Is that something that's possible?
Sure. Just to clarify initially, the official title of this is a convention for proposing amendments. It's not a constitutional convention. It's not a states' rights convention, but it's sometimes called a convention of states for historical reasons. If 34 states get together and they want to propose a constitutional amendment on any subject, they absolutely have that prerogative. I don't think that an amendment would be to abolish abortion, for example, would be saleable in the current environment. But a marriage amendment might very well be, and there have been some stirrings in the grassroots for marriage an amendment. I mean, if the Supreme Court's opinion on same-sex marriage didn't convince you that what we've been doing for the last 50 years doesn't work and that we need a new approach, then you're never going to be convinced by anything. I mean, it was kind of the ultimate thumbing of the nose at the American people. As the caller points out, all of these people in all of these states, there was something like 30 referenda.
38.
And what the advocates of traditional marriage won all but 3 of them. I mean, what a popular mandate! But it didn't matter. What will matter is that if we use the amendment process to overrule the Supreme Court, as has, by the way, been done successfully several times before.
Okay, let's...
real quick question from Katie.
Yes.
What is the difference between criminal syndicalism and sedition?
Criminal syndicalism is basically the formation of a conspiracy to advance a criminal purpose, which generally involves the overthrow of the government. So if you were, during the Cold War, if you're an active member of the Communist Party and you're participating in plotting the overthrow of the United States government, that's criminal syndicalism. Sedition can be a much broader term. I mean, it comes from a Latin root which actually refers to basically marching in the streets and, you know, creating a riot. But in the American and English legal tradition, it's also sometimes included in some laws any criticism of the government. Or during World War I, the sedition statute prohibited raising discontent with the conduct of the war. So sedition is a very, very broad term, and sedition statutes often go beyond the bounds permitted by the U.S. Constitution.
Okay, let's get back to the phone. Richard, you're on Talkback with Rob Natelson. Go ahead.
Thank you. Real quick, I agree with your previous caller about the feeling that the people we send to Washington aren't doing anything, and the only course of action we have left is a revolution of some kind. But if I'm not mistaken, if there was some kind of action like that in this country, wouldn't the president be able to declare martial law, which would extend his presidency until such point that it was over with, the revolution? Is that correct, or is that wrong?
No, I think that's wrong. The president does have broad power to suppress insurrections, but it doesn't extend, and I don't know any constitutional scholar who would say, or any lawyer or judge who would say it extends to actually extending his own term. I mean, that's pretty clear. And the last caller, and just to point out, before you go on, just to point out, the last caller did not say that the only alternative was revolution. The last caller said that she agreed that a convention of states needed to be tried.
Yeah. And let's get Joe on the line. Joe, you're on Talkback. We have a minute and a half. Go ahead.
Yeah, I looked at Black's Law Dictionary from the period when the income tax amendment was adopted, and typically you look for the intent of the framers, if I'm not mistaken. So the definition of income at the time was a profit or a gain, as from what I remember reading in Black's Law Dictionary of that period. Does that illuminate anything about the income tax, or have we changed the meaning of income to gross receipts, or where I'm going with that?
The definition of income is, however, Congress or the state legislature wants to define it in the statute. Let me caution everybody regarding Black's Law Dictionary. Black's Law Dictionary has no authoritative status. It's sometimes a useful guide where lawyers are consulted first as the beginning of research, not as an end of research, but just as the beginning. And most of the definitions tend to be late 19th century, early 20th century, really does not have any constitutional standing at all.
All right, we have less than a minute, Rob. So if folks want to find your book and get more information about Independence Institute, what can we do?
As always, it's been great to be on your show. And by the way, I forgot to mention my biggest accomplishment, which is the raising of 3 lovely daughters when I was asked for accomplishments. I'm at constitution.i2i.org or independenceinstitute.org, and my book is The Original Constitution, What It Actually Said and Meant, and you can get it on Amazon. Fantastic. Rob, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. We look forward to it next month. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye. All right, there you go. So what's coming up tomorrow? We have Walt Caro, our tax pro, on. CPA will give you your answers if you need them on tax questions. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.